Hello viewers, and a warm welcome to the show this evening. I am your host Chef Andy, and of course, as you can see, I'm joined by Nasuju, who's a guest who's been on our show before, but I will of course allow her to say 2-3 words and say hello to you all before I proceed to introduce the dish of today. Nasuju?
Thank you very much, Chef Andy. I'm glad to be here back again. My name is Julie Nasuju. I'm the chairlady of Royal Patches, and also I'm a model representing Vitiligo, and also I'm a mother of 4, and I'm also a DJ.
Perfect, Nasuju. Now, before we introduce the ingredients that we'll be working with today, I will of course mention we're going to be working on a very simple Mediterranean dish. We're going to be making a chili and tomato based farfalle pasta. And of course, very importantly, before I begin, I'll give you an idea of what we're going to be using for this recipe. And very importantly, as always, I'm going to be sharing some beautiful tips at the end of the show for some of you who may have some different alterations to this very simple recipe. So from the very front, you'll require 1 tin of some peeled tomatoes, a few cloves of garlic, and about a teaspoon of some chili flakes. You can of course use fresh chilies as well. You'll also require some dried basil leaves and a bit of some paprika powder. You're also going to require a nice beautiful portion of some farfalle pasta, a bit of some red wine vinegar, a bit of some, just a few pieces of some cheddar cheese, about 1.5 pieces of some white onion. You can of course also use red onion. You'll also require some fresh sprigs of some fresh parsley, some salt and some black pepper to season with, a bit of some sesame oil which we'll be infusing to the dish. I'll also be using some vegetable oil through the process, and last but not least, some water to aid you in cooking your pasta. But before we begin, very importantly, I will allow you to grab your pens and papers if you're taking notes, and we'll catch you after a short break. Proceed to pound that down, and once done, very simply seasoning your water, which we're going to be using just a bit of some oil and a bit of some salt. So I'll begin by drizzling over about a tablespoon of some cooking oil. Hello viewers, and welcome back. As I mentioned as we began, I did of course introduce the guest of today, who is Nasuju. Some of you who may of course have seen her on the show before. She managed of course to make some time to come and learn yet another beautiful and simple pasta dish. Today we're going to be focusing on a Mediterranean style of cooking, and I will of course be sharing some very simple tips just to aid in giving you some beautiful alterations to this very simple recipe, if you're of course going to be trying to make it in your very own home kitchen. Now we'll of course begin by boiling some water. Remember, this is very crucial that you begin by boiling your water way in advance, making it quite easy for you to cook your pasta as you of course continue to make the best for your sauce. So we'll begin by adding some water into a pot. Right, so as I always mention, very important to always have some seasoning to your water, especially if you're making pasta. Remember, very important that you actually sustain a very good consistency of flavoring right through. And one particular good way of making sure to do so is by seasoning your water, which we're going to be using just a bit of some oil and a bit of some salt. So I'll begin by drizzling over about a tablespoon of some cooking oil. So vegetable oil or even olive oil is a very good alternative. And of course, add a bit of salt. And all you need to do now is allow your water to come to the boil before proceeding to add your pasta. This of course gives us a bit of time to socialize. And now, just to mention, Nasuju also is a very, very big foodie, and she actually has a small cafe that she actually runs on her own. And we're going to be basing a bit of conversation on such, for some of you who, of course, have your very own small cafes maybe out there. And we, of course, as chefs, always encounter some different challenges, especially when trying to deliver some good food to clients out there. Even on most occasions, some of us may also struggle to maintain the beautiful consistency of food. And of course, most importantly, retaining our clientele. Now, Nasuju, you had mentioned that you have a small cafe.
Yeah, I don't know if I can call it a cafe. To others, it's a cafe. For me, I know it's a kibanda restaurant. For those people who know what kibanda restaurants are, this is one of them.
Now, I'll begin by translating that. Now, for some of you who may not be familiar with the term kibanda, this is basically a makeshift kind of a cafe. You may, of course, have passed some of such cafes around your neighborhoods. And these are particularly very, very good spots that you can be able to enjoy some very beautiful and easy to afford local Kenyan cuisine. Now, something I've realized over the time that I also tried to do business in a kibanda.
Yeah.
I do, of course, on many occasions, always remember difficult clientele or people who don't actually make your day. Maybe they actually try and leave without paying, or maybe they actually want to score a free meal.
Yeah.
Have you encountered such situations in the past?
Yes, I have. Especially now, like when you're having a kibanda restaurant. One thing for me, it's like a container, and I have a sitting area outside.
Okay.
So when most of the clients will kind of target when you enter the kitchen to go and maybe you're taking the dishes and all, and you find someone when you're coming back, the guy has gone. Something that's so annoying. And
this, of course, we're aiming this at some of you out there who may be watching and you may be fond of doing so. Very, very important to always remember, it's not a very, very good gesture to walk into a cafe or a kibanda of any sort, take the pleasure of enjoying a meal and escape or take off without paying. Very, very important to always remember that karma is very, very bad, and it will, of course, always catch up. I've actually had a situation in the past where a client managed to enjoy a meal and they took off. And right at the point where they were actually almost dashing off, one of the clients that was sitting next to him actually stood up and decided to chase after this guy because he had realized that this guy had not paid. So it's actually also very, very important to remember, especially for those of you who are running small food businesses, always remember to try and maintain some good relationships with your clientele or with your customers. And this will, of course, limit or remove any chances of them actually disappearing without paying. Now, what, for instance, is a way that you'd deal with such situations?
For me, I can say I'm lucky that I have a few people who I can trust. That whenever a client leaves, they'll just knock at the kitchen and tell me, hey, what customer anatoka? And then I will leave and go check out and ask for my bill. There's one guy who particularly who tried to run but didn't get very far because the next kibanda that was around managed to
they managed to get hold of it before he was too far.
And my question is, why would you go somewhere, eat a meal and run away? Why don't you just come and tell the person, just ask politely.
Exactly.
I am hungry, I have not eaten for several days, could you give me some food?
And maybe they can
pay
in a later date.
And
maybe
I'll pay
on
in a
credit.
later date, on
Exactly.
credit. And maybe I'll agree on that. Then come into it and then run. It doesn't make good sense because the minute you run, you never know what you'll meet with.
It's
you might
true.
run,
As I said,
and there's
bad,
a bus coming by. When you're trying to cross the road,
you may actually get knocked over.
Yes.
That's very true. Something also I've encountered, especially with us Kenyans, is some very, very complex, somewhat complex terminologies that we use with food. I remember, I think my most favorite one was a chapati surwa. I think you're very familiar with that term. Now, for some of you out there who may not be familiar with this, I would recommend try out some of these cafes or these kibandas. There are some very, very beautiful terminologies that we've, of course, formed with some Sheng or some bilingual language that we've actually managed to come up with. I don't know, maybe there's some you can share with the viewers, some common ones that you have at your kibanda.
No, there's chapo pasua, mandazi pasua, and the mandazi pasua is just a mandazi. You just cut it open, and then you put some fries inside. That's chips, chips muitu.
Okay.
Then you pick some of the chips, you put it inside, and some kachumbari,
and it's a snack to go.
It's a snack to go.
Now, some of them may also not be familiar with the term chapati surwa. Maybe you can give them an idea of chapati surwa.
It's just chapati that has, you just cut it into small pieces, put it on the plate, and then you just put soup on it.
So some of you who have not actually taken a chance to eat out, I do recommend. It's actually quite an interesting ordeal. If you do have maybe a cafe that you've been walking past, maybe next to your residential area or your neighborhood, maybe walk in there and you can actually be able to learn some of these beautiful terminologies, and they may actually be terms that are particularly aimed at some of the dishes that may be also a favorite to yourself.
Yeah.
Like for instance, the first time I tried a chapati pasua, a chapati sura, it was actually a very, very nice and quick dish. And it's also very, very unique in a way that it's a combination of a bit of soup, maybe from some beans or maybe some meat that you may have, some stew that you have already done. And it incorporates a beautiful flavor to it. It's also a very, very good, easy to go meal, maybe one of those quick and handy meals that you can actually be able to enjoy. And you can actually just consider it a very quick and easy lunch. Now, another thing I've also encountered is a lot of these small kibandas, a lot of them also do not focus on cleanliness. What would be your advice to some of them that
for me, I would advise that cleanliness, one, is next to godliness. And no one can go somewhere and you think the place is dusty, it's dirty, and just sit down and feel comfortable eating.
It's true.
So long as, for me, I believe presentation matters. How you present your food and how you present your place, that's when you can attract your customers. Even
that's very, very
when
true.
you're displaying something like in a boutique, how you always look for the best clothes that will attract a customer from afar.
And the best display actually brings you, it actually brings the attention to
So if it is a kibanda, it's okay, it is a kibanda, but make it presentable. Let it look clean. For me, for instance, what I've done with my kibanda, yes, it's a kitchen, it's a container. My kitchen is white. I've painted it white. It's everything there I make sure is very clean.
And of course, for some of you who may not know, white of course emphasizes cleanliness and hygiene. It's of course very, very easy for you to also detect dirt, especially on white surfaces.
Yes.
Yeah.
Your utensils, the rags that you use to wipe your dishes should be white also, showing cleanliness. So someone cannot feel, amepanguzia kitu, they've wiped something. No, make sure it's clean. And for the outside part, because that's where it's the open area.
That's where they actually sit at the most cases.
Open area. For me, I've made sure there's a carpet. You know, these plastic carpets that you can at least every day wipe the place.
And they're actually easier to maintain. Does actually needs just a bit of rinse or maybe a clean mop, and it actually looks very presentable.
Very presentable.
And it also makes it easier for you to clean maybe droppings of food on the floor.
Yeah. It's just something simple. Things for Juakali. The Juakali people understand this, but how you present it is how you're going to attract more customers.
And then maybe you can also share a pointer with the viewers at home, or even the viewers that may, of course, have their own kibandas. What are maybe some of the things that you stress on every single day that pretty much keep customers coming back?
Yeah, one, don't cook food for the sake of cooking.
That's true.
For me, don't cook food for the sake of cooking, because you will cook and you need this customer the next day so that you can earn this money.
It's true.
So when you cook food just for the sake of cooking, you've served someone githeri, the people who ate the top layer enjoyed the food. The people who are eating the down layer, you've added water. You're chasing away the other customers.
It's an inconvenience to the customers that enjoy that bottom part of the pot.
So just make sure your food is cooked well. Again, hygiene also really matters. How you make sure you have something, you've covered your hair. You know, when you're cooking, you're busy, you're moving up here, up there. You've not even covered your hair. You find some hair has entered the food, and the customer will just call you, it's
true.
And the customer will just leave just because of a simple mistake, something you would have avoided.
That's very, very handy, actually. And also something also to add, also very, very important to stress on, personal hygiene is, of course, very, very important. Some very, very simple basics, such as keeping your nails short, tying your hair back, maybe not wearing jewelry that is of
Yeah.
course coated in some kind of gold or silver coating, because these small details can actually wash into your food. Sometimes it's not actually desired. You may
Yeah.
not want to do it intentionally. And another thing also to mention, makeup, especially for the ladies.
Yeah.
I have, of course, also been to situations whereby you can actually maybe find a vendor or the person that is preparing the meal is maybe overly covered in makeup.
Makeup.
And this is also something that puts off a client, especially when
Okay,
you...
you can still do makeup, but be very particular about your makeup. When you apply makeup, I'm sure even the makeup artist will tell you more about how to deal with heat with makeup. Because the heat and makeup, the makeup will start melting. Would you
It's
want
true.
that to drop on the food that you're going to serve a customer?
And being that there's a lot of chemicals that come part and parcel of these products, you also may actually end up poisoning your client while you're actually trying to be pleasing to them.
Yeah.
Very, very good pointers there, Nasuju. Now, we'll of course bring you back to the show. As I mentioned, we're going to be working with pasta today. I'm going to be touching on a very, very simple touch of Mediterranean style of cooking. But before we begin to make the base for the sauce or the base for our pasta, we'll begin by adding our pasta into our boiling water. And while Nasuju does so, I'm also going to light up the pan right next to me. Now, very, very commonly, you will find that Mediterranean cuisine is very, very much based on bases like tomatoes and a very, very light touch of seasoning. We're going to also be incorporating just the same technique. So for this, I'm going to be incorporating a bit of some tinned tomato. You can, of course, be able to acquire the same thing. So the simple technique I use, maybe if I was to use this as a tomato, so it's a very, very simple technique that I've used and I've taught people in the past. It's also a very, very simple way of getting your tomatoes to peel very simply. All you need to do, if this was, for example, a tomato, all you need to do is slice across right over the top and do the same thing by slicing across at the bottom. You can actually dip those in some boiling water with a bit of salt. And what happens is as your tomatoes begin to steam up, the skins will actually begin to peel off. Once you take the skins off by cooling your tomatoes under some cold running water or maybe even some ice water, the skin will actually come out very, very simple, and you'll actually be able to avoid having those little strips of skins from the tomatoes that actually float, especially if you're making something somewhat like a stew. But for some of you who are, of course, looking at a quick and easy alternative that's, of course, time-saving, you can actually be able to find some tinned tomatoes at your retail or regular retail stores. They're actually not so expensive. They will also save you quite a bit of time, and it will, of course, maybe save you the stress of finding that beautiful, perfectly ripe tomato to make your base with. Right, so as our pasta continues to cook, we'll begin by working on our base. So I'm going to be using some sesame oil for this particular recipe. Now, the beautiful thing about sesame oil, it actually carries a very, very beautiful flavor. But I will also mention it is also a little costly. So for some of you who may, of course, be looking at a cheaper alternative, I would probably recommend canola oil or vegetable oil, which is a little easier to afford. Right, so to begin the process, I'm going to begin by adding our tomato into our pan. And to that, very important to also mention, begin by making sure that your pan is nice and hot. Remember that little bit of heat will, of course, aid you in breaking down your tomatoes very, very simply. I'm just going to grab a spoon at the back. So this particular technique will, of course, aid in making sure that you can break down your tomato chunks very, very simply. And very important to also mention, especially when making a tomato base, by beginning with the tomatoes, you can actually be able to cook off the acidic element of the tomato, and it will actually begin to become sweeter as you continue to cook in the process. So something that you can also try out when you're cooking, especially maybe when you're making a stew that is maybe with a tomato base or with a lot of tomatoes.
Yeah.
When you start with your tomatoes, it actually removes that sharpness of the tomatoes, and it actually makes it a little sweeter as you continue to cook.
Okay.
Yep. Right, so next up, we're also going to be adding a bit of garlic to the pot. So this particular recipe just entails incorporating all your ingredients into one pot and allowing that to cook very, very slowly actually proceeds to give it a very, very beautiful flavor, and it actually builds the flavor as you continue. So to that, we're going to be adding our paprika powder. We're also going to be adding our basil. So I'm using dried basil for the fact that I could not be able to find fresh basil, but if you can be able to allocate or find some at your retail vendors, you can actually also proceed to use some fresh basil. Right, next up, we're going to also be adding a bit of garlic. So I'm also going to be pounding this down into a paste. Very, very simple tip. Add a bit of salt to your mortar. This will, of course, make it very, very easy for you to be able to break down your garlic into a paste. I'm also going to be adding some red wine vinegar. Now, this you can, of course, be able to also alternate by using a bit of some apple cider vinegar or some regular white vinegar, which is, of course, the one that's easiest to find at our smaller supermarkets next to us. And then next up, proceed to mince your garlic in your pestle with your pestle. So proceed to pound that down, and once done, very, very simply, proceed to work your mortar. That should take you a very, very short time. You can also alternatively just chop up your garlic. Have you tried this technique before?
Mm-hmm, yes.
So you actually have one of these at your shop, yeah?
Yeah.
And also something I can also share. I don't know if you do a bit of pilau at your kibanda.
Yes, I do.
This is actually also very good in breaking down those whole spices. So you can actually add your whole spices and a bit of salt, and you can just take time in grinding them. It will actually give you a very, very good powder that will, of course, make it much easier to enjoy your pilau without actually having to spit out the whole spices.
So can I ask, if I'm to make coffee?
Okay.
Coffee, you know, there is a certain coffee that needs spices.
Yes, yes, yes.
So should I put what specifically? If I put sugar, would it still react the same way?
Yeah, actually, any particular, for instance, if you're going to be making a meal, for instance, you can be able to use salt. If you're going to be grounding anything such as sugar, at times I actually do the same thing, especially when making tea at home. I, on many occasions, maybe use a bit of cinnamon sticks or maybe some cardamom pods.
Yeah.
What I actually do is I throw them in the same pestle and mortar, add a bit of sugar, and that will actually aid you in grinding them. So, for instance, even for coffee, also a very, very good alternative. But one thing I will mention, just to be on the cautious side, don't add too much sugar, because it will, of course, make your tea or your coffee very, very strong and very, very sweet. So be sure to make sure if you're going to be adding sugar at that stage, maybe abstain from adding sugar at the end of the process. Yes. Right, so into our pot with the tomatoes, I'm going to proceed to add a bit of my garlic. So take time and make sure to scoop all of your garlic and make sure not to waste any of it. And very, very simply, that should give you at least one nice whole teaspoon of garlic. So add that to your pan and mix that through. You're also going to be giving this a bit of spice. I'm going to be using some chili flakes, but you can, of course, be able to use some fresh chilies. But very, very importantly, remember, if you're trying to not make it too hot, be sure to slice your chili in half, remove the seeds, and you can actually use the flesh of the chili. It will give it a bit of a heat spice content characteristic, but it won't be too hot. If you're, of course, looking at making it very, very hot, you can, of course, add the seeds to it, and it'll actually be very, very spicy. So also another pointer to share, try and add your chili towards the end. That way it's not actually going to be too hot. So for the fact that we're going to be cooking the sauce for a bit of time and we'll actually want it to reduce, I'm actually going to add the chili a little later. And also very, very important point, also add a bit of water to your mixture. And what happens is the water is basically going to allow for the tomatoes to cook fully and break down completely. And it's actually also going to give you quite a bit of time for you to be able to dissolve all those raw spices that you actually added at this point. Now, our next ingredient on the list is a bit of some white onion. So I'm going to begin by slicing this into some half moon shapes. And of course, using a sharp knife will always make it so much easier. So into your pot with the tomatoes, proceed to add your onions. And one reason I like to add my onions in a bit of a chunky state is basically to give the pasta a bit of a texture. Remember, in most cases of some of you also watching, on some occasions you may of course not want your mixture to be too puree-like or more like a soup. And by adding your chunks of onions, this will of course cook very, very gently and soften through the process. And what happens is also going to give your pasta quite a bit of a texture. It also really tastes quite nice, especially when you bite into some cooked onions, and it also gives a very, very good appearance to your sauce. So I'm also going to be incorporating the rest of my onion. So I'm actually going to use about 1 whole white onion. You can of course also use a bit of leeks or some spring onions. They also give a very, very beautiful flavor. So once more, chopping those into some half moon shapes, making sure that the thickness is of course consistent right through. Add those into your pot. And all you need to do now is allow for the mixture to cook until it's half reduced. And we'll of course proceed to add the rest of the ingredients as we complete the process. But before we get there, I will of course allow for the dishes to continue to cook a little more. And when we do come back, I'll take you through the very simple process of finishing your chili tomato sauce and of course combining your pasta dish right up to the plating stage of the preparation process. So please don't touch that dial. We'll see you in a little bit. And as I mentioned as well, by using a pasta spoon such as the one we have on the show, makes it so much easier to be able to handle your pasta without actually using your hands. And a very, very simple technique as well is always to scoop from the bottom. So just twist pretty much from the bottom and just turn your spoon right around. Hello viewers and welcome back. For those of you who are just tuning in, remember you can recap on this and many other beautiful episodes that we've done in the previous past by subscribing to our YouTube channel. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya. And if you also have some comments, queries or suggestions you'd like to share with us, remember you can also write back to us through our Facebook page. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya as well. But now just to recap on those of you who have just tuned in, we pretty much began by blanching our pasta. We also finished making our tomato base, which we're right about ready to finish off now. And we're also going to be incorporating some last and final ingredients, which is of course to mention a bit of some chili flakes. So about half a teaspoon should do. And very, very importantly, proceed to also chop into that some fresh parsley. So using a sharp knife, bundle your parsley together on your chopping board and proceed to chop that as finely as you possibly can. Making sure, of course, to discard any bits of stems and use only the leafy green part. Now, also to mention, you can also incorporate a bit of coriander in place of parsley if parsley is not available to you. And remember, you can also be able to purchase some dried herbs in your retail regular stores. There are a big array of spices and herbs that are actually dried, and you can actually be able to use those, such as the dried basil leaves that are used in place of the fresh variety. But remember, if you can, of course, find the fresher variety, then that is pretty much better than the processed and dried variety that may be in your stores. Now, something, Judy, maybe we can also mention as we conclude the show. Is it very common that you've actually seen dishes such as pasta at vibandas within the city?
No, that is something that it's rare to find in kibandas. It's just normal regular food. We can say like beans, beans and maize, that's githeri, and maybe a bit of dengu, that's green grounds, and chapati, and some rice, and maybe black beans and peas.
All right.
That is what I know mainly. And some meat, kiasi, and maybe chicken.
Now, maybe then this is a recipe you can try at home, if not at your shop.
I can also try this,
you can
but
try
for
this with your kids, maybe
guests.
for special guests, maybe.
Yeah.
And I would recommend also for your kids. Sometimes also maybe if you're looking at maybe a less expensive lunch, maybe that you're trying to substitute, maybe for leftovers.
Yeah.
Pasta is also a good option. As I mentioned, the base of the sauce is something you can make in advance.
Yeah.
And you can actually maybe make this a day before, preheat it the day after, and maybe just boil your pasta, mix it in there, and it's actually going to save you much more time as compared to trying to make the whole dish from scratch, and of course going through the process of making the sauce from the beginning.
Yeah.
So I do suggest that you actually try it and maybe give us, maybe write us some feedback in the future.
Okay, I will.
Perfect. Now, just to finish off our sauce, I'm also going to add that little bit of our chopped parsley. Now, parsley does two beautiful things. It adds to color, and it also gives a very, very beautiful, rich taste to it.
Also
you can actually, and the scent as well.
Yeah.
And once that is, of course, mixed through, all you need to do is turn your gas off completely, but always be sure to check on your seasoning, or rather to correct your seasoning by adding a small pinch of salt. Remember, if you did, of course, use salt when grinding your garlic a little earlier in the process, be sure to also check that you also don't add too much. Otherwise, it actually may be very hard for you to serve this and enjoy the meal in the later stage. And of course, just to finish off, a bit of some black peppercorns, crush them nice and fresh. Of course, if you don't have those available to you, you can also still use some black pepper powder. It will make very, very little of a difference. Right, now that this is done, all we are left to do is now incorporate our pasta. So we can just straight through pour the pasta into our pot on the side. And as I mentioned as well, by using a pasta spoon such as the one we have on the show, makes it so much easier to be able to handle your pasta without actually using your hands. And it will, of course, aid in making sure that if there's a bit of water at the base of your dish, or maybe even while taking them out of some hot water, makes it so much easier for you to actually lift the pasta out completely without actually having all the water incorporated into your mixture. Perfect. Right, so now all you're left to do is just toss that in your pan. And of course, always do so very, very gently, just so that just to make sure that you don't actually proceed to mash your pasta. And a very, very simple technique as well is always to scoop from the bottom. So just twist pretty much from the bottom and just turn your spoon right around. And that should make it so much easier for you to make sure that all of your pasta is actually coated in the sauce. And also something very important, remember your sauce is always at the base of the mixture. Sometimes it could actually be very hard to do so if you're making a bigger batch. So you can, of course, also maybe take a different bowl on the side, pour your pasta in, and then pour the sauce right over the top. It'll also make it much easier for you to toss. Something also to add, if you do have some olive oil available to you, you can also drizzle some at this stage. It'll also keep your pasta nice and fresh. It'll also give it a nice, beautiful, glossy appearance, and it also adds to a very, very beautiful flavor. Now, of course, all we're left to do is proceed to plate. So once that's mixed through, all you need to do is grab your pasta spoon once more. And of course, with a mixture that's also nice and heavy, at this point, you won't really be worried about the splashing of the sauce like we did in the previous episode with the cream. So this actually is a little easier to serve. So all you need to do once more, take a nice big handful, or spoonful rather, and just lay that very, very gently onto your plate. Of course, mixing before scooping always ensures that you also coat your pasta in a bit of sauce. And this will, of course, make sure that your dish is not very, very dry at the end of your serving process. So I'm going to make a nice big portion out of this. Now this particular sizable portion can actually serve 2, or if you're actually going to be serving this to kids, it can actually go to about 3 or 4 kids for generous serving. But very, very importantly, I will of course allow you to be the judge of our pasta dish. And just to finish that off, I'm actually going to add some bit of cheese right over the top. Now what I did with this is basically I grabbed some cheese that of course had already been previously sliced. I just threw this in the freezer for about 10 minutes, and it actually gave it a nice beautiful toughness to it. And it actually also makes it easier if you don't maybe have a grater at home, or you don't have something that you can use to grate those big chunks of cheese. Breaking them into nice big chunks also gives it a nice beautiful appearance on the plate. Now, very importantly, before we conclude the show, I will of course make sure that you give it a taste. I'm just going to grab a portion from this pot of ours. Right, Judy, will you do us the honor of judging the meal of the day?
Okay.
Now this one is not as spicy as the previous pasta that we tried out with the black pepper, so it shouldn't actually be too hot.
Thank you. I was worried about that.
Now this one we did a very, very little bit, and of course with the chili in it, of course also means that we can't also use too much black pepper. What do you
tasty.
think? Very tasty?
But
Can you be able
also
to taste?
A bit hot.
A bit hot.
Yeah, but it's very good.
Now, if you're also looking at keeping the same dish, maybe if you're serving kids, all you need to do is avoid using the chili flakes or fresh chilies, and it's actually going to be nice and sweet.
Yeah.
Now, of course, as Julie has mentioned, a little bit of kick from the chili, but as I mentioned, if you're of course going to be serving this to diners who are of course not chili lovers, you can of course omit the use of chilies or the chili flakes in the mixture. And you can alternatively serve it on the side, or you can actually sprinkle right over the top. And this will of course make it easier for your diners or your guests to actually be able to tell that there is chilies in the mixture. And it's actually also very easy to also avoid. But also a nice small pointer to add on to this. For the cheese that I've used some matured provolone cheese. You can of course be able to alternate the cheese depending on your likes or your dislikes. And remember also to balance the flavors. Some of us may also be looking at having a spicy mixture but not very, very hot. One particular trick I can share is you can also add a bit of cream to the mixture before tossing your pasta in. And it's actually going to give a nice, beautiful velvety finish. And it's also going to be able to cushion the heat from the chilies. But as Julie has mentioned, of course, a little bit of chili to it. And we had mentioned it is a nice chili and tomato pasta. And that, of course, brings us to the last and final part of the show. And as always, I'm also going to allow Judy to just close the show for us by mentioning a beautiful pointer of how you can also be part and parcel of our show. Judy?
Okay, you can actually join Chef Andy, like I did, by texting the 5-digit codes you can see on your screen. And when you're texting, make sure you write your name, where you come from, and what you'd like to cook.
Thank you very much, Judy. So from us, it's a humble goodbye to you all. Stay blessed, and until the next episode of Dinner Guide, do have a lovely evening, and see you soon.